Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Matthew Silverman, Director of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to our lecture with David Epstein, who will be exploring historic documents that shape Jewish history. Thank you to our generous program sponsors, Edie and Art Hessel, for helping us bring this talk to the Haberman community. We also extend our gratitude to Andrew R. Ammerman for sponsoring our fall 2025 lecture series. Andrew dedicates this semester's learning in loving memory of Josephine and H. Max Ammerman and Stephen C. Ammerman. Sponsoring lectures is a meaningful way to honor or remember a loved one, or to mark a significant occasion such as a yard site, a personal or professional achievement, or a milestone celebration. Your sponsorship donations, as well as contributions at all levels, allow us to continuing offer these lectures free of charge for all participants. Our next free lecture will be an engaging conversation with Rabbi David Saperstein on whether the golden age of American Jewry is over. Rabbi Saperstein is one of the leading voices in the Jewish world and in the world at large. Among his long list of achievements and roles, he served as the United States Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom during the second term of the Obama administration. For more information on this program and how to get involved, please visit our website. As always, please feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. Kindly keep your questions concise and in complete sentences. We will address them at the end of the lecture, though you can submit them at any point during the presentation. This lecture is being recorded and will be available on our website. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. David Epstein has had a distinguished career as an assistant United States attorney, practicing attorney, arbitrator, and adjunct professor at Georgetown Law School. He served on the inaugural board of directors for the Foundation for Jewish Studies, which, for those of you who do not know, is now called the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies. And he was the founder of our Jewish Learning on Wheels program. Epstein co-authored Torah with Love, a guide to strengthening Jewish values within the family, which features a foreword by Elie Wiesel. The book was praised by the Jerusalem Post, which called it one of those books that can change lives. David is also proud of having placed third in a national American history contest for high school students. He believes the best reflection of his career is the quality of his next presentation. And with that, I now welcome David to join us on screen. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much. Today's newspaper underlines the overall theme of my presentation that I will do, and that will be, we're going to go through 250 years of documents. We're not going to go through every document, but major documents. Many of them are familiar to you, some of them are not, on whether Jews are treated as individuals or Jews is treated as a collective. And it's also part of my theme that because of October 7th and the reactions of the world to October 7th, that there is something new in the way Jews are being treated. Now, what happened in today's newspaper, there's an article in the Wall Street Journal, an editorial about, is Britain safe for Jews? On Thursday, and I will quote from the editorial, it says, on Thursday, authorities in Birmingham, England, the country's second largest city, prohibited the fans of an Israeli soccer team from attending a match next month, even though the threats to cause trouble are coming from the locals. What an alarming message from police, and it comes barely 2 weeks after an Islamist terror attack on a synagogue in Manchester. So here we have a situation where Jews are being excluded from coming to a soccer match because they're Jewish, because they're going to be supporting an Israeli soccer team. So you have a combination of Jewish fans, an Israeli soccer team, and they can't come, not because they're going to cause trouble, but because others who live in that community are going to cause trouble against the Jews who come there. So that's a collective consideration of the Jews. Now, it's interesting. One of the documents that I'm going to show you is the Magna Carta, which until I read it recently, I didn't realize that it also mentioned Jews. The Magna Carta is a well-known document from 810 years ago, where the barons of England wanted to limit the power of the king. And it's important because of that occasion that the barons were able to extract commitments for the king. But in Articles 10 and 11, there are Jews mentioned collectively. It has to do with the idea, and this is an idea that runs through much of Jewish history in Europe, that the Jews were the moneylenders, and we know that they were because they were excluded from many other activities. So here you have two provisions in 1215 that deal with Jews and says what happens if someone dies before the debt's been repaid, and whether the heirs have to pay interest or not. And Article 10 says the heir, if the heir is underage, doesn't have to pay any interest on the money that's been loaned to the parent or whoever borrowed the money. And also, if a man dies owing money to Jews. But here's a discussion in 1215 treating Jews as a collective. Now, what are Jews? And this is an issue we talk about a lot. And I've gone through quite a few documents, and I will bring to your attention a book that has 900 pages with documents that affected Jews in the modern world. I don't offer that I read each and every one of them, but I did turn every page and have a pretty good idea. And it has documents that are positive to Jews, documents that are negative to Jews, documents that were written by antagonists of Jews, documents written by Jews for themselves. And the interesting question to me is, when are Jews treated as a collective for their benefit? When are they treated as a collective for their negative? When are they treated as individuals? When do we want to be treated as individuals? When do we want to be treated as a collective? And it goes back and forth. And then, as I said, I think that after October 7th, there's a new phrase and a new way of looking at how Jews are being treated and what the impact is. Now, my Kesher Israel Rabbi Chaim Schaffner gave a Devar Torah where he said the Jewish people are not a nation. We have lived for thousands of years without a land. The Jewish people are not a religion, since many people are Jews but are not religious. And we're not a race, because a Jew from Europe and a Jew from Africa do not speak the same language, eat the same foods, or wear the same dress. I believe that the Jews are a family, says Rabbi Schaffner. One can never leave a family, and if you do, you are still someone's child and someone's sibling. The same is true of the Jewish people. Even if we leave, we are still part of it. Additionally, just as someone can be adopted into a family and they become truly part of it, the same is true of Jews in conversion. Functional families love each other unconditionally, and therefore the same must be true of the Jews. Now, I take the other side of the equation, not how we view ourselves as Jews, but how Jews are viewed by others, those who have political power. My primary focus is on Western Europe and the United States, where we live, though many of us come from Eastern European families and others from Sephardim from Northern Africa and the Middle East. And I will focus on some historic documents to make my point. My academic reputation is not at stake. I am not a professional historian nor a political theorist. I was a lawyer in courtrooms around the country, and I enjoy arguments. I did teach as an adjunct law professor from time to time, and I give thanks to the many scholars who have each written articles and books about the documents that I will reference. My contribution is to attempt to provide a few themes to these documents. And as I mentioned, to suggest that October 7th requires the introduction of a new term that I offer to explain how events on the Gaza border resonate in Europe, on the campuses and in cities of the United States and Australia and South Africa, and just about anywhere Jews may or may not live. What does it matter what others think of us? There are some who would argue that Jews can only survive if they maintain separateness, if they live apart. There are certainly features to support such an argument. The obvious one is kashrut, our dietary restrictions. Of course, our Shabbat observance, halachic requirements, our calendar, language, holiday observance, and marriage and family structure. On the other hand, we have never lived apart. In the Torah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all interact with other peoples, sometimes positively, sometimes negatively. Are Jews viewed individually or collectively, and what are the consequences? In the Torah, an individual, Joseph, the son of Jacob, becomes the most powerful political figure in Egypt. Then when a Pharaoh arises who knew not Joseph, all the Israelites are coerced laborers. We begin Pesach with, we were slaves unto Pharaoh. In the Purim Megillah, Mordechai the Jew is honored by the king Ahasuerus, the same king who forbid his minister Haman to order the extermination of the Jews. And then you jump ahead to the Magna Carta, which I've already mentioned, and then you have, but I'm going to go to modern times, and here we have the Declaration of Independence, which this coming year we will celebrate as 250 years ago. And of course, what's interesting here, two things. One, there was a very small Jewish population in the colonies and in what became the United States of America. But Jefferson and those who helped him in the writing of the Declaration of Independence started with these words: we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The good news is the Jews are not mentioned because we have the benefit of that concept. I know that the African slaves did not have the benefit of that, but it was always used over the next couple of centuries to seek to achieve equality among all people in the United States. And then the United States Constitution in 1787, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common events, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States. So again, there's some dispute as to exactly how many Jews were in the United States, but they weren't much on the mind of anybody. There may have been 1,500 or a few thousand, although I read somebody who suggested there were many more. But generally, it seems to be very, very low numbered, and they were concentrated in a few places like Charleston, South Carolina, Newport, Rhode Island, and New York City. Now, the Bill of Rights has a long history also, and it also doesn't mention Jews per se, and it has a history that has little or nothing to do with Jews. The drafters, Madison, of the Bill of Rights, he and Jefferson before him, together with him, had previously enacted the Virginia Bill of Religious Freedom before the United States was even created. Why? Because in those days, the state provided and recognized that a single religious denomination would receive the tax money from the state. In Virginia, it was the Anglican Church, and they were supported by the state of Virginia, or the colony of Virginia. In Massachusetts, it was the Congregationalists. At some point, Maryland was established as a Catholic state, but the Virginia Bill of Rights of Religious Freedom was an effort to try to do away with the state support. And there are two important decisions, phrases in the First Amendment that we should understand, whether we're lawyers or not. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. They're two different concepts, and they apply. The establishment of religion is you can't use tax money to support a religious institution. Now, for the past hundreds of years, the issue has been, well, why not, and when is it appropriate? And even just a few months ago, there was a case before the U.S. Supreme Court on whether you could support a charter school that was a religious Catholic school. can you support busing to religious schools? If you say, well, that's not religion, that's just getting the child from point A to point B. Why can't you do that? Is that establishment of religion? Can you, and there are any number of questions that deal with, can you support science courses in a religious school? That's not advancing religion, that's teaching them chemistry or physics or mathematics. Now, what if you get into biology and you have some who accept the idea of evolution and others who say it can't possibly have been, and that the Bible doesn't permit you to have the concept of evolution. But those are the kinds of questions that have been before the Supreme Court on an ongoing basis for the past couple of hundred years, a little less than 250. The Constitution wasn't adopted till 1787, and the Bill of Rights in 1789, 88, 89. So you have this issue of what constitutes the establishment of religion, but Jews are not mentioned. We're in it or we're out of it as a general principle. I sent my wife and I sent 5 children to the Jewish day school. When the last one of our children graduated, I made a speech there and I noted that we had 65 tuition years in the Charles E. Smith Jewish Day School, which was a record then and continues to be a record now, even though there have been families with more children at the day school, but they didn't all stay there from kindergarten to 12th grade. So, of course, I would have welcomed support and reduced tuition, as all of us would who send children to Jewish day schools. But on the other hand, we have this concern that we don't want to advance the cause of any particular religion. So then the question becomes, can you advance the cause of all religion? Then the other question is, what is a religion? And someone told me the other day that there was a group of people who had satanic, had witches and so forth, and they were offended that they were not considered a religion for a particular purpose. And then you have what's the free exercise of religion. Again, it's not specifically addressed towards Jews, but can a Jew, in the days when some states did not allow you to open a store on Sunday, and a religious Jew wanted to keep his store closed on the Shabbat but open on Sunday, was that a free exercise of religion? Is it a free exercise of religion if you want to wear a kippah or grow a beard when you're in the military, or wear tzitzit, or wear a hijab if you're a Muslim? So those questions came up, and over the years, many different variations of those questions have come up. There's a famous cases in the 1940s where the only Jewish justice on the court at the time was Felix Frankfurter, and he wrote the opinion dealing with a Jehovah's Witness child who didn't want to say the Pledge of Allegiance to the United States. Why? Because he said, we only recognize the higher authority of God and not the state. And he wrote, well, you've still got to do it. And then 3 years later, the court reversed itself, and Frankfurter dissented, and he said, and he took significance of the fact that he says, I come from one of the most persecuted peoples in the world, and I believe that it's okay, that it's appropriate to have everybody say a Pledge of Allegiance to the United States. Now, jumping back to how Jews were seen in 1790, here's a very famous exchange of correspondence between Newport, Rhode Island, and in August 1790, and the synagogue there, the Hebrew congregation in Newport, and George Washington, who was then the president of the United States. And George Washington made it a point in establishing the federal government and the significance of the executive of the federal government to make trips by all over the now states of the United States. And first he went to the south, and then he came to the north. And so the invitation by Reverend Satius says, and it's in bold here, deprived as we are heretofore been of invaluable rights of free citizens, we now are with deep sense of gratitude to the Almighty disposer of all events, behold a government erected by the majesty of the people, a government which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, but generally affording to all liberty and conscience and immunities of citizenship, deeming everyone of whatever nation, tongue, or language equal parts of the great governmental machinery. What's interesting in this letter is that George Washington, in response, copied some of that, but he added something that is of extreme importance. He says, and it's in italics at the bottom of page 6. He says, it is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it were the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoy the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. Now that's straight from Seixas's letter, requires that only that those who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, giving in all its occasions their effectual report. And then he talks, the next to last paragraph, about the children of the stock of Abraham and so forth. But the point was that Washington extended it, and he said it's not about toleration, because toleration is one group with power allowing another group without power to do whatever it wants to do. It says we're equal, and this is extremely important because this was not the case in Western Europe, and it certainly was not the case in Eastern Europe, nor was it the case in other places where Jews lived. So what happens? Well, in 1862, this is part of my theme, there's a different situation, and General Grant is fighting the Civil War, and he's in what's called the Department of Tennessee. And in that Civil War, some of the Jews are engaged in trading with the enemy and trading with the South. The Jews from the North, from Cincinnati and some of those locales, are trading against the rules. And General Grant says, he doesn't single out who they are. He says all of the Jews. He says the Jews is a class, and this is called Order Number 11. And there's a whole book on this document, as there are on many of the other documents that I quoted. This one, Jonathan Sarna is a professor at Brandeis that comes from an illustrious scholarly family, wrote a book on Order Number 11. And it says the Jews is a class. Now here, what I've been emphasizing before is the Jews are not a class. They're treated individually, and we think that's very important, and it is. But now they're being treated as a class and violating every regulation of trade established by the Treasury Department, are hereby expelled from the department within 24 hours. They're all expelled from the territory, and then everybody is supposed to leave. And so what happens here is that immediately there's an effort to get this order overturned, because this is affecting Jews who were engaging in trade with the South, with the Confederacy, and Jews who were not. The Jews, the trade had to do with getting cotton from the South and so forth, but that was funding the Confederates' rebellion against the North, against the United States. They go to Abraham Lincoln, and he immediately reverses Order Number 11, so that Lincoln recognizes that this treatment of Jews as a collective is not keeping with the major principles of the United States of treating every citizen as an individual, not as a collective. And as it happens, Grant, over the rest of his professional and political life, makes many amends to the Jews. He's the first president, I believe, who attended the dedication of a synagogue, Adas Israel Synagogue. President Grant was there. He was elected president some years after the Civil War. Andrew Johnson succeeded Lincoln after Lincoln's assassination, and then Grant became president and served for 2 terms. And Grant also was well disposed toward the Jews generally. Now, let's jump over to Europe. And this is very, very interesting because Napoleon Bonaparte had to deal with Jewish communities in France and the areas that became under French control. And he wanted the Jews to assimilate. And while it's not expressed specifically in any of the documents that he wrote, the historians say that Napoleon's plan was that he hoped that the Jews would intermarry and disappear as a separate uh, unit, that they would no longer be Jewish. And so what he did do, that part isn't, as I said, isn't in the documents that were sent, but he poses these questions and convenes what he calls a Jewish Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin dates back to ancient times in the land of Israel, where the Jews had the Sanhedrin, the official court, and he recreates that institution in France and poses these questions to them. And the Sanhedrin has to find answers that will satisfy Napoleon so that they get individual rights. Now, recognizing that just a few years earlier, the Declaration of Human Rights at the French Revolution had given everybody individual rights, the Jews weren't included in that. In fact, one of the leaders of the French political world said, to the Jews as individuals, we'll give them everything, but the Jews as a collective will give them nothing. And so here we have to treat with the Jews separately in France. This is France after the revolution, after the monarchy's been overthrown. So here was the questions, and here are the answers. The first question had to do with polygamy, and it says that in conformity with the decree of Rabbi Gershom ben Judah, polygamy is forbidden to Israelites. Now that's interesting. Rabbi Gershom ben Judah was a rabbi in Europe, and he issued a law, an opinion that for the next that's supposed to be in effect for 1,000 years. In point of fact, that 1,000 years has now expired. So theoretically, Jews who govern themselves by the opinion of Rabbi Gershom can now be polygamous. Not a good idea, but it's still permitted as far as Jewish law. Jews who were living under Muslim law were polygamous, but Jews living in Europe were not. And so here, at the time that this was answered, the Sanhedrin answered, they said polygamy is forbidden to Israelites. They also answered questions about divorce and religious acts of marriage, and that and the relationship of the Israelites, as they called them, to the non-Jewish fellow citizens. Number 5, that every Israelite is religiously bound to consider his non-Jewish fellow citizens as brothers and to aid, protect, and love them as though they were co-religionists. Then the Israelite is required to consider the land of his birth or adoption as his fatherland, because Napoleon is looking for loyal French citizens. Judaism does not forbid any kind of handicraft or occupation. That's an answer to the continuing issue about Jews as being the usurers, Jews as being the bankers. Now, there was an answer to that. Figure out some other way to loan money, and Jews won't be the bankers. But of course, for various reasons, Jews were the bankers. Jews were lending the money, and Jews did charge interest. And here they say Jews can also engage in agriculture. At number 8, manual labor and the arts, as their ancestors in Palestine did. And finally, Israelites are forbidden to extract usury from Jew or Christian. Now the question is, can you charge any interest? And at what rate is interest usury? There may be laws that define what usury is. Too much interest, but any interest. And if there's no interest, then what's the incentive to loan anybody money? Now, the situation changes in France later. This is the beginning of the 19th century. At the end of the 19th century, there's the Dreyfus Affair. And the Dreyfus Affair is a manufactured charge against a Jewish captain in the French army. saying that he's a spy on behalf of Germany. Well known, well known. And one of the people who was there covering it as a journalist was a man named Theodor Herzl, also well known, an Austrian journalist. And what Herzl concluded, and this is significant because this turns the page in terms of the Jews as individuals and Jews as a collective. Herzl concluded that the Jews in France were supposed to be treated as individuals. Dreyfus was not, from what I can gather, very much involved in Jewish life, but he was convicted. He was sent off to Devil's Island. He was basically in solitaire for 5 years there until the situation changed and he finally did get exonerated. But he was humiliated before he was sent away. And Herzl concludes that the Jews are not successful in being treated as individuals in what is considered one of the most enlightened countries in Europe. It isn't working in France. It isn't working in France. And therefore, there has to be some sort of a solution or approach that is collective. And that's when he starts with his interest in Zionism, creating a Jewish homeland. And as we know, his Jewish homeland, he wasn't committed that it had to be where it is today on the shores of the Mediterranean, eastern shores of the Mediterranean. He was committed to having a Jewish homeland. And there was the Uganda plan to have the Jewish homeland in Uganda, which was controlled by the British. Now, the British finally come around to the idea of a Jewish homeland. And there's various reasons. Arthur Balfour is the foreign secretary, but he comes out with a famous view of establishing in Palestine a national home for Jewish people. Again, the Jews are being treated collectively, but we would say this is a positive treatment of the Jews collectively. It's not a negative way of treating the Jews collectively. And David Lloyd George, who was the prime minister, thought that giving the Jews something would help win more Jews to the cause of the British, who were then involved with the French in fighting Germany and Austria in Europe, and that this would be an attractive way of getting more Jews involved in supporting the British Empire in its efforts. But this document then becomes critical. It's not, Herzl isn't the one who gets it done. A lot of credit is given to Chaim Weizmann, and that's a whole separate story also. But just to keep in mind, this is the Jews treated collectively. Well, only a few years before, in 1905, there was the Kishinev pogroms in Moldova. And what came out of that treated the Jews collectively? The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Now, there's another whole book by a historian written the last few years named Stephen Zipperstein. And he writes that contrary to the view that it was the Russian Secret Service that prepared the protocols, and the protocols say that the Jews have a secret organization designed to control the world. And in fact, Zipperstein says it wasn't the Russians used it, but they didn't create it. It was an editor in Kishinev who created that document. And I've seen the document. It is very repetitive, but it keeps on the same theme. Now, why do I mention it? Because it has legs. It's continued to be quoted and repeated and stated today, even though there's no evidence. In fact, I once, in a semi-humorous way, said, what bothers me is the fact that no one has ever come up to me and said, I'm one of the elders of Zion. Would you like to be one? I meet the elders definition, but why hasn't anyone ever offered me a position as an elder of Zion? Besides that, they've done a horrendous job. Look at the suffering the Jews have had throughout the 20th century and going even into today. And when I made that comment to a gathering, one of the persons in the audience who had a good sense of humor, if you can say that under these circumstances, went and had designed a T-shirt for me that said "Elders of Zion" in Hebrew and in English. Now the question is, should I wear it? If I'm an elder of Zion, I'm a target. On the other hand, if they control the world, that's more than I ever thought I was capable of doing. But it's interesting. Now, no one is controlling the world, I guess, according to the anti-Semites, means you have the access to all the Jewish money and everything else to control the world. And I assure you, I don't. The Rothschilds have never invited me to take over their bank accounts. But it's interesting that idea is resonant today, and you will find it in the documents and speeches of today, that the Jews control the world. And in fact, you will have this notion of Jews controlling the world. I think it's part of Islamist propaganda about Jews controlling the world. So again, this is a collective. You have, and also Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. There's a book called The Peculiar Protocols. It wasn't written by A. Conan Doyle. It was long after. It was written by a man named Nicholas Meyer, who's taken the characters of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson and written several books with them. And he has, and I've read the book, he has Sherlock Holmes and Watson going to Moldova at the time and trying to explore and find out what are the protocols of the Elders of Zion, where do they come from, are they real, are they fake, are they fabricated as for a collective objective to stigmatize the Jews. So that's a book that was written probably within the last 5 or 10 years. So an idea once it gets started, and especially if it's useful to someone, whether it's positive or negative, it gets used. Now, this Balfour Declaration, as we know, led in 1948 to the Declaration of Israeli Statehood. And again, this is the Jews being treated collectively. But here it's a positive. The land of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here their spiritual, religious, and political identity was shaped. Here they first attained to statehood, created cultural values of national and universal significance, and gave to the world the eternal book of books. So you have a reference to the Hebrew Bible, and then there's another whole book just on the Declaration of statehood, and interesting, and it's quite interesting. It's written by American scholars, but there were 3 or 4 different writers of it at different times, and the final version that was accepted was by David Ben-Gurion himself. And one of the issues, and this gets a little bit away from my overall theme about collective and individual, was there were most of the people involved in writing this were not religious people. Some of them were very anti-religion, but there were a few people who were religious, and they wanted some reference to God in the Declaration of Statehood. The term that they finally agreed on was Sur Yisrael, the Rock of Israel. That was sufficient to satisfy the reference to God, and sufficiently ambiguous not to reference God, and satisfied both the secularists and the religious people. And you will find that reference to the Rock of Israel, Tzur Yisrael, in the Israeli Declaration of Independence, of Statehood. And it's a very interesting document in many ways. But then there's another dimension to the creation of the state of Israel, and that's theological. Again, it's a collective. And the 2 chief rabbis of Israel, Rabbi Isaac Halevi Kook, Herzl, I made a mistake here. Isaac Halevi Herzl, Herzog it should be. And the Ashkenazi and and Rabbi Ben Zion Uziel, the Sephardi chief rabbi, because there are two chief rabbis in Israel, came up with a phrase that is said in many synagogues in the world, but not all of them. And the phrase is, Reshit Smichat Gulotenu. In the prayer that we say for the state of Israel, we say that this is the first flowering of the redemption. That's a religious concept. The Hasidic world, the Satmar, who don't accept the idea of the state as being having any religious significance. In fact, I think they think it's an anti-religious event. They don't say it. Other Hasidic groups, I don't believe, say it. People on the super liberal progressive side of the Jewish spectrum, I'm not sure that whether they say this or not, but it is it's an issue, but I think in mainstream Orthodox, conservative, and I think in Reform, I think it is said Reishi Smikat Gulutenu, the first flowering of the redemption, and that's referring to the redemption and the coming of the Mashiach and so forth. So that was a prayer that was created a few months after the declaration of statehood by these two rabbis. Rabbi Isaac Herzog is the grandfather, was the father of Chaim Herzog, who was a president of the state of Israel, and his grandson is the Isaac Herzog is the current president of Israel, and for the past few years until replaced by another ambassador, Michael Herzog is also a grandson of Isaac Herzog. So that Herzog family is obviously very important in the bloodline of the state of Israel, and you have the rabbi and then his successors. Now, I want to go to a few other documents. How am I doing on time? All right. All right. Then this collective notion, when it's used against us, is of course with the concept of anti-Semitism, which was a concept developed by a German in the 19th century, and Wilhelm Marr, and that the Jews are a race, and that they're Semitic race, and that they're a problem in their deficiencies, and that becomes very important in the evolution of anti-Semitism as a racial concept, and also in the Nazi ideology. And there's a place near Berlin, a suburb called Wannsee, Wannnsee, maybe one N. And Wannsee is where the Nazis met in 1942, I believe, to define who's a Jew. And based on ancestry, and and you can go there, and they have the documents that the Nazis agreed upon as to who's a Jew. Well, you have questions about is a Jew if you have a Jewish grandparent, if a Jewish man is married to a non-Jewish woman, or vice versa. What are we going to do with them? What are we going to do with their children who are mishlings or mixed children? And I just had learned about one of my college classmates who had this very interesting and sad story. He was born in Berlin. His grandparents were Jews who had converted to Christianity. His father was baptized, and in 1937, the father of about 5 children recognizes that his future in Germany is not good, and he leaves Germany. He comes to the United States. My classmates' 4 older siblings go to England for safety. The mother of this classmate is an ethnic German. She's been from a distinguished German family for 10 generations, but she has mental problems, and she goes to an institution, a mental institution, and he's raised during the war by his aunts, his German aunts. And the irony of ironies is his mother, the German, ethnic German, is the one who's killed by the Nazis because she's a mental defective in the view of the Nazis. They weren't just killing Jews, although that was a major activity and a major objective. So the German ethnic mother is the one who's killed by the Nazis when they're killing people in mental institutions. The father is in the United States. The siblings are in Europe, and my classmate is able to is a German. I mean, whatever his aunts are, no one questions it, and he survives. And he later comes to the United States, and he came alone. He was 10 years old, 11 years old when he crossed the ocean. And this is a side story, but he says he didn't know what his father looked like when he arrived in New York. So he decided that he would wait on the ship until almost everybody else was off the ship, and that one of the few people waiting on land would be his father, and that's the way he and his father reunited. But the irony that the mother, who's the ethnic German, is the one who's murdered by the Nazis, and the Jews escape, and he escapes because he has Christian grandparents, is just one of those many stories that come out of the situation like the Second World War. I have a number of copies here of the Declaration. Now, what changes as a result of this October 7th, in my view? There is a concept in physics, and I don't know physics very well, for small particles. It's called, they're not able completely to explain, or maybe not at all to explain, why small particles can affect each other even at a distance beyond the speed of light. That if this particle is shaking, this other particle is going to start shaking also. And it's been one of the great mysteries of physics. And the phrase that the physicists use is called entanglement. You haven't been able to explain it, but there is a relationship that so far has defied the physics professors and students, that this particle on one distance from another can affect each other. And that's my view as to what October 7th means, that there is an entanglement, that something happens in Israel, and anti-Semitism and Jew hatred and blaming the Jews for everything in the world that you're not satisfied with. There's an entanglement, so that even people who are not friendly to Israel, Jews who are not friendly to Israel, Jews who are antagonistic to Israel, no one's going to check them out if they're an attack on a synagogue or a temple or whatever you want, because Jews are now entangled. And that, to me, is why I started the story with the Birmingham volleyball soccer game, that the people who would show up to the game, I don't know what their degree of Jewish involvement is, but just the fact that they're soccer fans, some may be Israelis, some may be Jews that are not Israelis, they may be antagonistic to Israel, but they're going to be affected. They can't go to the soccer game because that's the way the Birmingham officials have decided that they're going to keep the Jews out, the Israelis out, the fans of the Maccabi team out, and instead of trying to keep the potential violence makers under control. They're going to keep the Jews out. We're entangled. And that's the concept that to me, after so many years of trying to deal with anti-Semitism by Jewish organizations, is one that I think helps explain what has happened in the world. I don't say the golden age is over, and we'll hear Rabbi Saperstein at his next presentation talking about it, but there is an entanglement now that is stronger. It's always been around in some fashion, but we never called it that. I'm offering the term entanglement, that what happens to Jews in Israel, what happens in Israelis, is going to affect us, whether we know what the connection is or not. On October 7th, everybody said Israel has a right to defend itself. And then on October 8th or 9th, well, anything you do, we don't like the way you're defending yourself. So that's the major point. I want to summarize. Jews are treated as individuals. It's been good for us. Jews are treated as individuals. We sometimes welcome it. Jews are treated as collectively. Sometimes it's very bad for us. In fact, in Eastern Europe and even in Western Europe, the Jewish communities were not happy with this. Some of the rabbis were not happy with this idea of treating Jews as individuals. Why? Because they felt correctly that it was going to destroy not the purpose for it, but it would have the effect of destroying the community, the Jewish community that was living semi-autonomously. That was their concern. And in large extent, that's what happened. They didn't welcome the idea that Jews would be treated individually. They wanted the Jews to be treated collectively. So, where are the questions?
Thank you, David, for such an engaging and thought-provoking presentation. We've started to receive some questions, and for those of you out there with questions, please feel free to send more in. So it looks like we're ready to go. I'm looking here. Somebody just noted that the order to exclude Jews/Israelis from the soccer match has now been rescinded.
Okay, that's good to hear.
Yeah, that's good to hear.
That's a result of this program.
Exactly. Yeah. One question about you've mentioned how Jews and others have perceived themselves or been perceived by others. I wonder if there's any text or if you have any thoughts on how Jews have defined themselves. Such, I mean, what makes me think of, for example, is like Jews for Jesus. I once worked with somebody in a nursing home who was a Jew for Jesus, but he grew up with two parents. I think his father was even a rabbi. He grew two parents who were Jewish. And have you come across anything where how Jews have defined themselves or ways in which Jews, are in conflict about that and how that relates to the greater world?
Yes, as a matter of fact, Rabbi Haberman, when he was the rabbi at Washington Hebrew, once had a situation, and that he told us about, where he had a young man who was a member of a family in the congregation who brought his fiancée to Rabbi Haberman, and asked that she be converted to Judaism. And Rabbi Haberman said, okay, why does she want to be converted to Judaism? And the young man said, because she wants to become a Jew for Jesus, just as I am. So the young man who was Jewish by birth wanted to become was a Jew for Jesus, and he wanted his non-Jewish girlfriend a fiancée, to first become a Jew so she'd become a Jew for Jesus. Rabbi Haberman said, well, I'm not going to do that. But so you had this situation. And then in Israel, the issue came up whether a Jew for Jesus was a Jew. That's another whole separate issue about who's a Jew for purposes of of the right of return in Israel, and there are a number of cases, and there have been cases in England also about who's a Jew. The question of you have to have a Jewish mother. Well, that's the halachic answer. That's Jewish law. But there's a famous case, Brother Daniel, who became a Catholic monk and wanted to immigrate to Israel as a Jew, and the Supreme Court of Israel said, "But you left the Jews." He wasn't antagonistic to the Jews. He just, in fact, the Cardinal of France about 20 years ago was a Jew who had become a Catholic and eventually became a cardinal in the Catholic Church. Now, is he still a Jew? So you have this question about who's a Jew, and it comes up in England. You had a case about somebody. There's a school, Jewish school, that said we only take Jews, and the person had a Jewish father. The child had a Jewish father, non-Jewish mother, and they wouldn't let him into the school. And the courts in England said, well, but that would be a violation of our racial laws. So they forced the school to accept it. So that question about who's a Jew is one. You said, how do we define ourselves? Well, I guess it depends.
Yeah, definitely. It's been a complex question throughout Jewish history, really. And um, looking at the other questions here, are there other countries that have made proclamations about Jews? Are you?
Um, well, there are lots of countries that made proclamations. I mean, over the centuries, um, and yeah, I'm not sure whether asking proclamations positive, negative. I mean, I think that in most places, I would think that in the European Union, that most the Jews have equal rights with non-Jews there. I think there are some places where they use tax money to support every religious institution. I think in Germany, uh, I don't know this for sure, but I believe in Germany there's tax money is allocated based on how many members they have and so forth. Yeah, so there are lots of, there've been edicts all over in Austria and over time, and in fact, my own supposition is that the Jewish in my own family, my grandparents were married in 1901 in New York City, but they went back to Poland where they had family. But they then immigrated in the late 20s to Mexico because they couldn't get into the United States. And my supposition is that what happened in between was that Poland became an independent country after World War I, and therefore they had to define who's a Pole, and that was somebody who spoke Polish and was Catholic, I suspect, and Jews didn't meet those requirements. So not everybody feels. I've talked to Jews from Mexico, and some of them, and they say that they don't feel Mexican. They love Mexico; it's been very good to the Jews, but they don't feel Mexican. So there are countries that are more ethnically based, and therefore they don't. In the United States, I think most Jews feel very American and Jewish.
Yes, I think that that's very much so. Um, I see somebody here mentioned the Kaifeng Jews in China, and I also before you, if you have anything to say about that or anything about the Asian communities, I want to also just highlight that a few of the topics that you brought up have been programs that we've had at the Haberman Institute over the years, and if people are interested, as in our follow up, we'll send some links to old programs. But we actually had Steve Zipperstein, I believe you mentioned, speak about um, now the word escapes me,
The protocols of the elders of
the
Zion.
Protocols of the Elders of Zion in his book about the pogroms, and it's not coming to me at the moment. We've had several on Asian Jews also, but we several other topics you brought up. I'll have to remember after the program that will include links in our follow up materials if anyone's interested and more learning more about those specific subjects. Um, I don't know if you have any experience or thoughts on some of the Asian communities.
I don't. Dara Horn writes about the Kaifeng community, I believe it is in. No, not that. She does. Harbin. She writes about Harbin, the Jewish community in Harbin, and in the book that she wrote called "People Love Dead Jews." Uh, there was a significant Jewish population, I think, populated largely by Jews from Russia. But I think, as you point out, there each of these documents that I mentioned has been the source of a book and lectures and so forth. And I think that's great that you can pull those together and I'll say that I did the great summary.
Yeah, yeah. No, definitely. It's definitely a unique subject. We've gotten several people saying thank you. One person said that this is one of the best topics in presentations. So people really appreciated how you put together thoughtfully. And really, it's just if somebody wants to explore some subject in much more detail, there's always avenues for that. Um, one question here is asking, do you feel that Judaism is not a religion? I guess kind of going back to how you started the program, what do you have any more thoughts on how what you think about that?
No, my own view is that that's the central part of the Jewish peoplehood concept. People are Jews. You know, one of my nephews says that there are 4 or 5 different kinds of Jews. There's Torah Jews, there's uh, bagel Jews. He says there are uh, uh, Holocaust Jews, there are Israel Jews. But I think that the thing that is central is our history and Judaism. I know that that many people will disagree with me, but I think that's where what when we observe a holiday, when you observe Passover, that comes through Judaism. You can say it's a national holiday and it's a time for the family to get together and it's something like Thanksgiving. But I would argue that in some form Judaism is the glue or the foundation, and that the manifestations can be in a lot of different ways. But yes, I think Judaism is so central, and I think I don't know enough about, but I know a little bit about the Armenian Christian community. They connect nationality and religion in a way that seems to be different than it's not just a faith; it's part of their national existence. Whereas the general view of a Christian, of a Catholic, I think, is that it's a faith. As a matter of fact, one of the documents that I did wanted to mention, but I failed to, was Nostra Aetate, if I might, for just a minute or two. This was in 1965, after Vatican Council II, which was brought into existence by John the 23rd. He was succeeded by Pope Paul the seventh, I think it was, the sixth. And there was a document issued, and a Jew named Jules Frank, I believe, had met with John the 23rd and promoted the idea that the church had to do something in light of the Holocaust. And John the 23rd had been very positive as a cardinal in helping save Jews when he was in Turkey, and Jews who were trying to escape the Nazis. And John the 23rd was sympathetic to this notion. And they issued a, encyclical after he passed away and the successor came in which he said that all Jews are not responsible for the death of Jesus. That had been for 2,000 years, that was the concept. He said some Jews were, but not all Jews, and certainly the Jews who exist today are not responsible for the death of Jesus, and that we have to understand that Christianity comes out of has a relationship to Judaism. John Paul II, who was later a pope for many years, he was very positive, and he called the Jews their older brothers. Now there was one issue that kept on. That's a theological issue. Did they call the two covenant? One was there was a covenant between God and the Jews and the covenant between God and Jesus through Jesus Christians. That's a At first there was some support for that notion in the Catholic Church, whether that covenant between the Jews existed, but it created a theological problem for the Catholics because the idea was that the Catholic doctrine that the existence of Jesus supplanted and and overcame any pre-existing covenant with God, and if the Jews wanted to have a connection with God, they had to come through Jesus. So that issue in some was not dealt with in the Nostra Aetate, but it did have an enormous effect. It's been 50 years and it had an enormous effect on relations between the Jews and the church. And so I think that that's something worth understanding and recognizing. And the fact is, the church did recognize the state of Israel. So those are important events, and the popes have have been in varying degrees have been very positive about Jews. Pope John Paul II was very positive. John the 23rd was, but they haven't been. None of them have been negative in a way that was the case in earlier centuries.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for sharing about that. Definitely an important moment in relationship between Catholicism, Christianity, and Judaism. Um, there's a couple of questions here that sort of relate to what we were talking about just before that, and sort of how, about the Judaism piece of it. One person asked, how do you classify, or these might be questions, more broad, the broad you, but like, how do you classify a Jew who says that he does not believe that there is a such thing as God? Um, and somebody else noted that, as I understand, we are defined by three nouns: a people, a land, and a book. Um, if you have anything further to say about the Judaism piece of it, but
How do I classify them?
hmm.
Uh, I don't. The question before, I wouldn't classify. I wouldn't be the one making the classification. My point was that Judaism underpins that whatever that individual, if that individual has Pesach, if that individual does anything that is consistent, that it's likely that it comes out of Judaism, even though it may be doing it as a secular thing, just eating a piece of matzah and going to a table and saying we were slaves under Pharaoh, but it comes out of a religious background. So uh, I'm not going to. The theological aspect of it is I'm aware of it, but I'm not really in a position to give any insight into it.
Yeah, yeah, I appreciate what you said there, because I mean, I guess in my opinion, similar, where maybe some rabbis would say the God piece is central, but maybe people practice Judaism in many different ways, whether it's holidays and such. Your sort of theology doesn't necessarily have to be the central piece to defining Judaism. Um,
I wouldn't say it's not the central piece to defining Jewishness. It may be the central piece to defining Judaism, may or may not be, but it's not Jewishness. That you could have it. You can support the Haberman Foundation. That's an aspect of it.
Yes, definitely. So I think this is a good opportunity now if you have any final thoughts that you want to share with us, to leave with us this evening, and then we can begin to wrap up. So, is there any last thoughts that you want to share?
No, I think I appreciate the opportunity to share the thoughts that I do have, and as with everything, I think we're all in a process of trying to understand the world today against our history of the past, and our own commitments, and that those for for coming generations. I mean, everything is so it's particularly active in terms of what's our role in the world and why do we have to deal with so much uh, sadness. That's very tough. Okay,
Yes.
thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank
Yeah.
you for the opportunity. I appreciate it, and it's I always enjoy. I think this is a great institution. It's been around for what 40 plus years, right? I
Yeah.
think I think any institution. I think someday I read once that on the stock market there was only one company that had been on for 50 years, and I think that company's not as part of the companies that were followed most closely. So I think any institution that's been around for more than 40 years in the Jewish world uh, and has been doing good and spreading knowledge and information is worthy of support and recognition. Thank you very much, Matt.